So in this set of videos, I'm going to do something a little bit different here in that I'm going to work through an exercise more real time, see whatever issues I encounter. I'm going to try to walk you through more of my thought process, more of dealing with this. Now, I have sort of previously in the background sort of tested, verified this process, so there is work that I've done before this, but let's see what happens here. And the general overview of the process is we have these Arista switches. So for example, to pick one of them, I have this Arista switch 6, and it has ports fast Ethernet or ports Ethernet 1 through Ethernet 7. So if I look at the show running config of this switch, you can see Ethernet 1 through Ethernet 7. Now, in order to not mess up my virtual machine, I need to not configure this Ethernet 1. But let's say we wanted to configure this Ethernet 2 through 7. Now, we also want to start thinking broader than this, in that we have Ethernet 2 through 7 on this one Arista switch, but we also have Arista switch 5, Arista switch 7, Arista switch 8, and they have ports 2 through 7. And then obviously in any real life example, you're going to have a whole bunch more switches and a whole bunch more ports. So we need to have in the back of our mind that when we're thinking of this problem, we need to think of some broader solution that will enable us to cover a broader set of devices and a broader set of ports. Now, what do we want to do on our switch configuration? We want to configure some VLANs, and we've done VLAN configuration previously. We also want to configure the switch port to a given VLAN. We want to configure whether it's trunking. If it is trunking, we want to configure the native VLAN. We also want to configure the VLANs allowed on the trunk. So those are the things we're going to try to start out to configure. A set of VLANs, trunking or access mode. If access mode, the VLAN the port is on. If trunking, the native VLAN and the trunk or the VLANs allowed on the trunk. So now I have a blank directory here. I'm on one of the lab servers. The first thing I want to get working is I just want to get connectivity. So it's very likely we're going to need to use EOS modules from Ansible Core and the Napalm EOS in order to accomplish this. So the very first thing is I just want to get my providers created. So I'm going to make dir for group vars. I also know that I'm very likely going to need some host specific variables, meaning that port to VLAN binding is not going to be the same for all the Arista switches. So that is going to likely be a switch specific characteristic, so that's likely going to be in host vars. Now for group vars, I could put a arista.yaml directly in here, or alternatively, I could make dir arista, which I'm doing, cd into arista. Now I need to create the provider. And I'm not going to recreate this because we've created it a bunch of times. So I'm just going to grab one from somewhere earlier in the course. I'll grab it from, let's say class 8, exercises, group vars. Look what I have here. I have all these YAML files. I'm just going to copy those into here. Now I'm in the, I had CD there, not copy, so I'm going to copy them. Now I don't actually need, I'm going to move all.yaml back into the base group vars. I don't need the cisco.yaml. I don't need the juniper.yaml. I don't need the nxos.yaml. And I'm actually going to rename this to be providers. Now let's look at what's in here. So I specify my platform, and then I have an Ansible core module for SSH, an Ansible core module for eAPI, and I have a Napalm provider. I go back into group vars and I also added this all.yaml. We actually probably don't need anything from this, but it's not going to hurt anything, these global variables. Okay, so now I'm going to start creating my playbook, and I'm just going to call it testpb.yml. I go ahead and say it's a YAML file, give it some name string. We'll say configuring switch ports. We will specify which hosts we're going to run this on, and let me remember what I named that switch in inventory. So in inventory, I called that PyNet switch 6. So I'm only going to configure a single switch at this point. PyNet switch 6 is the one switch I'm going to configure. Now the very first thing I want to do is I want to verify connectivity. Perhaps Napalm connectivity, perhaps Ansible core connectivity. So in this case, let's just do them both. I'm going to call the EOS facts module. Now I forgot a hyphen. The tasks need to be a list of tasks. So I forgot my hyphen there, so I just re-added it in. And then I need to specify any arguments under EOS facts. So I'm going to specify my provider. What's the name of my provider? My provider name is here. I'm going to have a bias to wanting to use the API, so I'll grab that one. Now remember, when we're specifying a variable here, use your quote, double curly brace variable name. Now I've specified EOS facts but not Napalm yet. Let me test if this works. See if we have everything set up correctly. Now in your case, you would probably just want to start with a working example and copy this in, verify that it's still working for your new playbook. Now, I'm going to add a name string just to say what we're doing here. So testing connectivity, get rid of that extra hyphen. Now I'm going to copy these 3 lines, and I'm going to do testing connectivity Napalm. Now this is going to be Napalm get facts, specify a provider, and our provider for Napalm is creds underscore Napalm. Replay this playbook, see if it executes for both Napalm and for Ansible core. So at this point, we know we have a working playbook. We know we can connect to this one Arista switch using Ansible core modules and eAPI. We know we can connect using Napalm and also using eAPI with Napalm. So we've established our connectivity. We're communicating to the switch correctly. Now the next thing we need to specify is we need to start creating things. And I think a logical place is to start with the VLAN creation. And I say to start with the VLAN creation because you know you're going to need the VLANs when you configure the ports for access port or for trunking. So now I'm going to go ahead and open up another window here. Go ahead and SSH into the switch. Now when you're working out the config that you need to create, a good practice is to first create it on a test switch. So let's look at what VLANs we have here. Right now we only have VLAN 1. And then let's just pick 7 VLAN names we want to configure. and give them 7 names. Okay, so we'll just call this that. And then we're just going to repeat that for VLAN 701, 702, 703, all the way to 706. So we go back to our other window. Now we have this question of how do we want to configure this? Do we want to configure this via napalm and a merge operation, or do we want to configure this using Ansible core modules and just configuring it, straight via CLI and going into config mode and playing ours? I'm going to use napalm in this situation. I think you could realistically do either, and it wouldn't really matter for this initial config. There's some reasons why when we get to the later on to the Switchport config, and also when we have all our combined config, which means both the VLANs and the Switchport attributes, why I think napalm would be slightly better, and I'll explain that hopefully a little bit more when we get to that, where that'll make more sense. Now, if we're going to use napalm, the first thing I want to grab is just a working napalm example for config. So I'm just going to go back into our course examples. I think napalm was 5. We'll go into one of these exercises, and I'm just going to grab one of these because I want to remember the syntax. Go back into our playbook. Get rid of those extra line numbers. So that's line 13 through 20. Delete that. Make sure our indentation is the same. We're going to install the VLANs. And we had a very similar process to this earlier. So we're going to have a configs directory. We're going to have a VLANs.txt file. We're going to initially not commit our changes. We are not going to be doing a replace config operation. We're going to be doing a merge. And we're going to generate a diffs file. Right now I'm not going to save the output. This provider is creds napalm. Now we need to create our configs directory. We need to create our diffs directory. We also need this file that it's going to be looking for. Now initially I'm just going to manually create this file. In a minute we'll convert that over to templates. So I cd into configs. I remember my inventory host name, which is touch. That's the inventory host name, and then I think I called it vlans.txt. So that's the file where ultimately we're going to create it from templates, but now I'm just going to statically create it. Go back here to our VLAN config, copy this, and I missed the first part of that, and the first part of this was this. I'll look in the running to see what the indentation is, just so I match that. Okay, so it looks like it's indented 3 spaces. So I will indent 3 spaces here. Now I'm just going to copy these. We'll configure 7 VLANs. Okay, just making this all consistent with the VLAN numbers. Do a quick glance at that, make sure it looks right. Looks like I have my 7 VLANs. Now I'm going to go back into my playbook and I want to manually execute this. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is just like with Python programming, you want to be repetitively testing your playbook. So start with a simple case, make sure it works. Expand on that, make sure it works. Expand on that, make sure it works. And get in this habit of fairly small cycle between modifying your script and executing it. Modifying your script and executing it. Now let's see what happens. I wouldn't be surprised at all if we get errors at this point. Now at this point we actually don't care about the Ansible core module connectivity. We do care about the Napalm connectivity. Here we're installing our VLANs. Now we're in commit false mode, so it shouldn't have actually changed anything. Now let's go and look at our diff file that was generated by Napalm that's going to tell us the changes it's going to make. So here we can see the VLANs that we're going to add. So we can see the VLANs that we're going to add as part of this process. Now, in the next video, we're going to start converting this into a template, generate this from templates. We're then going to start layering on the Switchport configuration. One other thing we need to do with respect to the VLANs is right now I have my VLAN data embedded in my config file. I'm not going to want that when I get it to Jinja 2 templating. I'm going to want my VLAN information stored as variables in some way, either in the inventory system or relative to my playbook in some way.